Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so incredibly excited you're joining us today because we're on a mission. We're going to completely demystify the science of how our brains juggle, or, sometimes totally drop, multiple tasks at once. Look, we have absolutely all been there, right? Trying to fire off an email while pretending to listen to a meeting, or cooking dinner while trying to catch up on the news. But what is actually happening inside our heads when we try to pull this off? Well, let's find out.
So I want to pose this question directly to you. Can we truly do two things at once? If you ask around, you're going to hear some pretty extreme views on this. Some folks will fiercely argue that multitasking is a total myth, literally impossible. And then others will proudly claim, oh, I can do 5 things at once without even breaking a sweat. And, well, obviously we have to validate the basics here. I mean, we're all breathing, we're maintaining our posture, and hopefully not falling over, all at the exact same time. So there's a layered reality here that we really need to unpack.
Now, what's really fascinating is how ancient texts can sometimes capture concepts that resonate perfectly with modern science. Take this quote. We're using it here strictly as a modern metaphor, just to beautifully illustrate the singularity of our conscious attention. It perfectly sets the stage for the scientific deep dive we're doing today. Basically, while our bodies can physically do a whole bunch of things at once, our core conscious focus is remarkably singular.
Section 1. The 5 categories of processing. Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand multitasking, we have to define the playing field and organize how the brain actually handles information.
So the brain's workload is essentially split into these 5 categories. First up, we've got parallel background processing. This is your brain handling sensory input, your posture, your movement, all simultaneously without any conscious effort from you. Second is automatic processing, which happens when heavily practiced tasks need just a tiny bit of conscious supervision. Third is controlled conscious processing. This is the heavy lifting. Think novel reasoning, doing complex math, or making tough decisions. Fourth is task switching, where the brain rapidly alternates between tasks rather than doing them together. And finally, dual task performance, where 2 tasks actually do overlap successfully, usually because they use totally different mental resources or one of them is highly automatic.
Moving on to Section 2, the attentional bottleneck. That brings us to the second layer of our reality, what actually happens when 2 demanding tasks collide head-on.
Meet the attentional bottleneck. In plain English, you can kind of think of your brain's executive system. That's the part handling your active thinking and decision-making as a narrow doorway. When you try to shove 2 really demanding tasks through that single doorway at the same time, they get stuck. They compete. So the brain is forced into what we call task switching. Instead of truly running both tasks at once like a supercomputer, your brain frantically alternates, constantly switching its attention back and forth between the 2.
If we contrast these 2 states, honestly, the difference is staggering. When you're single tasking, you get high performance and your working memory retains information fully. You're in the zone. But when you hit that central bottleneck and start rapid task switching, well, there's a heavy tax on your executive functions. With every single switch, you lose context, you lose speed, and the accuracy of your working memory takes a massive hit. Trying to do 2 completely novel things at once is just incredibly draining on your system.
And we can see these exact scientific costs in a 2022 working memory study. Researchers looked at what happens when participants try to remember a sequence of letters while simultaneously reacting to different visual or auditory tasks. Across 3 large experiments, they found that dual tasking significantly decreased working memory performance compared to just single tasking. The bottleneck forces serial processing, and managing that lineup basically eats up your working memory. Now, it is absolutely crucial to note the limitations here. This study used simple laboratory stimuli like letter recall and basic reaction times. And that might not fully mirror the super complex dynamics of the real world.
Let's jump into Section 3, the power of automaticity. Because our brains are incredibly adaptive, which brings us to a really fascinating hack for getting around this bottleneck. Let's look at how practice actually changes our cognitive limits.
So this is the concept of automaticity. Simply put, when you practice a task heavily, your brain learns to run it with way less conscious supervision. Think of an experienced driver talking to a passenger on a familiar, quiet road. The driving itself is largely automatic, and that frees up the limited executive capacity in the prefrontal cortex to actually focus on the conversation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the practice formula. Step 1. Practice a specific task until the steps become fast and automatic. Step 2, this lowers the executive demand on your brain. Step 3, you can now combine it much more effectively with a compatible second task. But I want to be incredibly clear here, guys. This lower supervision, yes, but it absolutely does not build 2 independent conscious minds. If that experienced driver suddenly hits a dangerous, icy patch of road, boom, that automaticity breaks down instantly, and the driving demands full 100% conscious attention once again. Two recent studies give us some great nuance on this. A 2026 Georgetown fMRI study looked at whether extensive training can remodel neural circuitry to bypass the frontal bottleneck, basically by offloading categorization tasks to the temporal cortex. But we really must strictly emphasize the limitations here. This was a small sample of just 12 to 20 participants, it was limited purely to visual categorization tasks, and it absolutely does not prove true parallel processing for complex reasoning. Similarly, a 2026 +1 study looked at walking while spelling words backward. They provided sample data for just 2 individuals in an observational pilot. It merely shows that even a seemingly automatic task, like walking, still actually taxes prefrontal resources, especially in older adults or those with health conditions. So, to be clear, neither of these studies proves we can consciously multitask complex novel thoughts.
Which brings us to Section 4, the deep focus contrast. What actually happens neurologically when we deliberately avoid the bottleneck entirely and engage in deep, singular focus?
Well, researchers have attempted to look at intense, focused attention through various cultural and religious practices. For example, a 2019 EG pilot study looked at the sajda, the prostration position in Muslim prayer. While they observed changes in brainwaves, we have to rigorously point out that this was an extremely small pilot with only 5 participants. Plus, it surprisingly showed opposite EG effects in men versus women. Additionally, a 2024 systematic review looked at 5 cross-sectional studies regarding Qur'an reading and cognitive function in older adults. Now, while they noted positive correlations, these studies had a moderate to high risk of bias, they were observational only, and they entirely lacked the ability to prove causation. So, while single-task focus is heavily researched, we always have to view the scientific evidence through a lens of strict methodological scrutiny.
Section 5, the final verdict. So, how do we synthesize all these complex layers of science we've unpacked today into a definitive conclusion? What is the actual reality of multitasking?
Well, here is the absolute, scientifically grounded reality. Multitasking is partly real, partly illusion. The brain runs automatic processes in parallel. But 2 unfamiliar conscious tasks usually become serial. Practice lowers demand on one task, it does not create a second conscious mind.
Which leaves us with this final thought. You have incredible abilities to automate routines and process background information. It's truly amazing. But when it comes to the heavy lifting of conscious thought, your attention is a singular, precious resource. Since you only have one conscious mind, what will you choose to focus it on today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.